Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's John Schofield. I'm from the Archaeology Department at the University of York, where I've been since 2010, doing a combination of cultural heritage studies and contemporary archaeology. And it's contemporary archaeology that I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. Specifically, I'm going to give a talk called The Seahorse and the Cotton Bud. This is an image that many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. It's an image from 2017 of the small estuary seahorse Hippocampus cuda tethering a plastic-stemmed cotton bud in the polluted waters off Indonesia. And I often use this image to describe the kind of archaeology that I do and the way in which I try to use archaeology to address some of the world's global challenges, and particularly those challenges related to planetary health. And let me just give a few examples of why I find this image useful. Maybe looking at this image, your eye was drawn first to the cotton bud. It's a very familiar item. We use over 13 billion cotton buds every year, mainly for cosmetics, mainly single use. And about 1.8 billion of these cotton buds are plastic stemmed, although that number is slowly decreasing in favor of the more environmentally friendly wooden stemmed cotton buds. And about 10% of the cotton buds we use end up in the ocean. So immediately there, you've got a relationship between people, between humans and human behaviors and planetary health. And those cotton buds contribute to around 8 million tons of plastic entering the ocean annually. And that contributes to about 150 million tons of plastic that are now floating around or sitting on the seabed of the world's oceans. And this figure is estimated to treble by 2025. Your eye may be drawn to the seahorse, perhaps. And as I say, it's the Hippocampus cuda, a small estuary seahorse now classified as a vulnerable species. And it's been classified as a vulnerable species partly due to the traditional medicine trade. So again, there you've got that relationship between culture and nature. And organizations like UNESCO, who manage World Heritage Sites, are increasingly viewing culture and nature as one and the same thing and not two completely separate entities. And this makes it easier for those who work both within the cultural and the natural realms to address plastic and its impacts. It allows integrated programs of research to be organized in a much more efficient manner. And plastics now exist in both geological time, in stratified geological deposits, and also in archaeological deposits as well, as often as microplastics, but also macroplastics as well, the larger pieces. And these plastics appearing in geological strata have contributed to an understanding of what we now refer to as the Anthropocene, that period in which humans have had a fairly dramatic impact on the planet. So that's the global picture, but then we can also draw this right down to the personal level as well. Research at the University of York recently published, in fact, just before Christmas, when this was in the news. The PhD researcher Evangelos Dinopoulos fronted up a project in which it was demonstrated that microplastics exist within our bodies. And according to Evangelos, cell death and allergic reactions are potential effects of ingesting or inhaling high levels of microplastics. So this is really serious, both on the level of the planet and planetary health, but also our personal health and well-being as well. So where does archaeology fit into all this in a conventional sense? I described earlier my role as a contemporary archaeologist. I started out as a conventional archaeologist, dealing with things that are from the ancient world, if you like. That very quickly transitioned into a recognition that actually there's no separation between ancient and modern, between then and now. So on the left-hand image, for example, you have Roman amphorae, and on the right-hand side, in the Canyon of Panier off the coast of Marseille, 1 kilometer down, is a deposit of plastic and so perhaps some glass bottles, which would have probably contained water possibly wine in the case of one of the bottles in the middle there, but mostly those are water bottles. So here you have two very different examples, 2,000 or so years apart, but both characterized as seabed deposits of archaeological material that has resulted from human behavior. As an archaeologist, I'm interested in how long things have been around for. So stone tools or ceramic vessels, for example, one might look at them and one might decide, for example, by analyzing their form or their content, or the materials from which they've been made, or the context in which they were found, that they've survived for, I don't know, 50,000 years, 2 million years, 500 years or so, and so forth. That's the traditional role of the archaeologist, to understand both how things got to be where they are today, the human behaviors that created that situation, but also how long things have survived and why they've survived for so long. With contemporary archaeology, the kind of work that I'm describing here today, we kind of turn the telescope around, I suppose, and look not into the past, but into the future. So with a plastic bottle, for example, that we find on a beach or on the seabed off Marseille, the estimate, and it is only an estimate because plastic's only been around for 100 years now, is that this bottle is likely to survive for about 450 years within a marine environment. And archaeologists increasingly are referring to this as a kind of toxic heritage, a heritage of now that archaeologists will continue to look at into the future. So from there, let's go to Galapagos. And we've panned into the Galapagos archipelago. That piece of land on the right-hand side of the image that you can see is the coast of Ecuador. Guayaquil is just there where the estuary cuts into the land. And Galapagos is about 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. So it is remote. There's a number of islands and islets and rocks in Galapagos. 4 of the islands are inhabited. 3 have sizable populations, 1 only a very small population. About 25,000 people live in Galapagos, and it receives about 130,000 tourists a year. About 90% of the land in Galapagos is national park, with very strict restrictions on what can be built there, and public access, and what people can do in those areas. And about 10% of it is towns and farms, where there are fewer restrictions. It's a very dynamic landscape. It's a volcanic landscape, so it is constantly changing. It's also where a number of underwater currents, deep underwater currents, come together, bringing cold water and nutrients from the south down from close to Antarctica. So it's a very rich marine environment because of that. You probably know all about that from watching some of David Attenborough's recent programs. You'll also know, if you have watched any of those programs, that Galapagos is home to some of the highest levels of endemism in the world, and this relates both to terrestrial species and marine species as well. And it was partly for this reason that Darwin came here in the middle of the 19th century and was able to develop the theories of evolution that he did. And I find it fascinating that some of these giant tortoises that you see in this image would have been around in Galapagos when Darwin was actually there in the middle of the 19th century. Like everywhere, Galapagos has a plastic problem, we know that. Galapagos is also very well known, it's iconic, and it's on most people's bucket list. So any research findings in Galapagos are going to draw more attention than perhaps a project in Bridlington would. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and therefore it's of outstanding universal value. So it is of relevance and of value to everybody on the planet. As I've said already, it has these remarkable levels of endemism as well, species that are unique to Galapagos. And I suppose the final reason, and the most relevant, is that they came to us, in fact. So it was the people of Galapagos, the people who work in the national park, who see this problem, who came to some researchers in the UK, not me initially, but people who work in marine biology, for example, asking for help and trying to find a way of developing a solution to this problem that they were facing. So what's happening in Galapagos? What is this project that I'm a part of? It's called Plastic Pollution-Free Galapagos, and the aim is to make it exactly that, plastic pollution free, particularly related to single-use plastics, but also some of the other plastic items that are creating significant problems for the archipelago, fishing gear in particular. There are three aspects to the project. There's the modelling aspect. So there's work being undertaken, for example, at the University of Utrecht in Belgium, which is modelling the behaviour of plastics within the waters around Galapagos, where they're coming from on the ocean channels, and other taps, if you like. If we think about taps and sinks, taps is where it comes from, sinks is where it ends up. And one of those taps is the international fishing fleet that operates just outside the protected waters of Galapagos. So the modelling is trying to establish where the materials have come from and where specifically within Galapagos they might end up. So where the pressure points are, if you like. The biological impacts are the impacts of plastics on marine species, for example, and the behavior change, which is where I come in, is what does this all mean and how can we start to change people's behavior and turn off some of those taps so that there's less in the sink, as it were. And that's, as I say, that's where I come into it. But it's part of a much larger and more complex project that involves scholars from all over and practitioners from all over the world. And I've got a slide at the end which shows where some of those people are from. So the archaeology specifically involves some very traditional archaeological approaches. So doing a survey of a beach, for example, you can see at the top left and also the bottom left as well. The top left, it's macroplastics, a lot of fishing gear in that image, for example. And the bottom left is collecting microplastics from a sandy beach in Galapagos. And then the other four images show different types of collecting and also material culture objects, artifacts, as I would refer to them, that are being found on these beaches and being collected. And then those materials are taken from the beaches back to the lab where they're studied and investigated. And by studying and investigating, again, we're using traditional archaeological methods, although in this case, there are some unique factors. So, for example, a lot of these objects that we're picking up have writing on them, which ancient objects tend not to have, and also barcodes and other information such as websites, which one can use to then research where this material originates, when it was brought into production, when it might have been sold, and then the journey from its use to its arrival on a beach in Galapagos. So it can start to create this narrative or object biography, as we refer to it. But the crucial thing here is that we're doing this not on our own, ourselves, sealed away in a lab somewhere, but we're doing this with a much wider community of participants, including in Galapagos school children, politicians, shop owners, and so forth. So we're really trying to spread the message, I suppose, that this is all down to human behavior. There are all sorts of other arguments around whether plastic production should be stopped or certain artifacts, certain items, certain products should not be packaged in plastic, but something else that's more environmentally friendly. But the bottom line is that it all comes down to human behavior in the end. The image you see on the right is a chart that's been created showing some of the ways in which people have answered some of the questions that we presented about some of these artifacts. One of the other things we might do is look at the logos, and some of these logos are kind of date limited. So if we find one of those, if you look at the 1973 Pepsi image, for example, if we found a bottle or a can or something with that particular logo, then we know it's from before 1973, for example. So again, we can start to date some of this material using logos. But the web is an obvious source for this, and having a laptop with us, which we can use to actually research some of these products as we find them, is really useful. And here we are engaging with that community that I've mentioned. In the case of both of these images, young people in Galapagos, you can, I hope, see from some of their faces that there's a great deal of enthusiasm for this project. That I presented it to them as, be an archaeologist for the day, and they really enjoyed that experience in researching some of these very familiar items. So that brings me to the close, really, and I suppose that the crucial thing here is that the work that we've done in Galapagos, that there are many people around the world, many projects studying marine plastics and marine plastic pollution in a whole variety of settings. But what makes this project distinctive is that we're using archaeology alongside a whole range of other more familiar methodologies. And as far as I'm aware, at least, ours is the only project that's using archaeology in this way. And contemporary archaeology, we believe, has a really significant role to play in helping to understand, at least, and therefore hopefully also mitigate this, this particular challenge that Galapagos is facing. Will the findings and the impacts of this be confined to Galapagos? Well, that's a big question. We hope not. In this image and this quotation, we come back to the fact that Galapagos is very well known for the theories of evolution that were developed here through the visit of Darwin in the middle of the 19th century, and this paradigm shift that work created. And while we're not on the same scale as that, we are hoping that this project will provide that kind of eureka moment, that realization really, that not only can the problem be tackled in a slightly more creative and imaginative way by using archaeology, but also that, that it might help people to realize just how much of a factor they are in creating this problem. So by taking an archaeological approach to familiar items, we can really bring this problem home, I think. Thank you very much.